How do I decrease the brightness?
Top right. Yeah. Top left. Make it black.
Hey guys, welcome to round 3. I'm doing 2017 chair for this round. Do on the motion that in terms of questions are considered reported by today's standards and right Prime Minister to start the debate. Here.
Sure, Robert E. Lee or Emperor Hirohito may have been products of their time. Impact on the present about how people see themselves and how people see each other. And that's why we remove statues or monuments of historical figures with abhorrent values. What is our stance? First of all, monuments or memorial standards must be judged based on how these historical figures or ideals interact conceptions of morality. So that while both Robert E. Lee and Abraham Lincoln's ideals, Abraham Lincoln was instrumental in establishing our present conception of creation of African Americans. Whereas Robert E. Lee, unlike the progressive that Lincoln was, fought for the continuity of an oppressive status quo. That is the distinction we are drawing between figures that are deemed abhorrent and figures which we may be okay with. Secondly, we are happy to move many of these monuments to museums or sites where they can be appreciated only within the historical context. For example, where Cecil Road, where it can be appreciated the historical context that he was a racist. And here I am happy to move them into the exhibit about these things. So we're going to forward 2 very simple arguments. First of all, that monuments are and secondly, that they prop up racial supremacy in a tangible way. Of these monuments and memorials is actively oppressive. Let's make it clear. The problem with historical monuments and memorials is a dimensional view of a nation's history. Victors, often white majorities, which enshrines a biased view of the narrative of what has occurred. They often enshrine those individuals who held these false views to begin with. We think that monuments have a special place in the public sphere. There are some harms that result from this. First of all, it prevents people from being able to actively engage appropriately with their history. We think that monuments, when placed in the public sphere of a parliament building, for example, are appropriately stripped of the historical context. Like, for example, the fact that Robert E. Lee is viewed favorably as an important figure in the Civil War. Enshrine these figures if they are not able to appreciate properly the historical context in which these events occurred. It makes it far easier for these monuments and memorials to be utilized for white nationalists or individuals seeking to manipulate history for their own purposes. So we think that placing monuments at least in the public strips them of the historical context. Where Cecil Rhodes is placed on an elevated pedestal in Oxford, it enshrines him in the repulsive ideals he held and makes it easier for his history and the narratives that he created to be perverted. However, secondly, and more relatedly, it prevents alternative viewpoints from gaining traction in history. Having statues in these important positions shapes our perception of history. There's something special, as I mentioned, about placing a statue on a pedestal. It imbues with it a certain degree of legitimacy in public discourse, because often they are regarded as symbols of our nation, symbols of an institution, or at the very least have some kind of government backing. So placing a symbol and placing a memorial or monument on a pedestal imbues it with a special sense of legitimacy. We think this is problematic because it shuts out alternative history. Like, for example, it's the slaves that built the Washington Monument, the history of oppressed gender minorities in the USA. All these are shut out due to the prevailing dominance and the prevailing enshrinement of individuals in monuments and memorials. It's much easier for these views of history to gain traction without the looming specter of these monuments and memorials to shut them out. So we think that the presence of these memorials is actively oppressive because it shuts out alternative histories. But moreover, we think it is actually offensive to many minority groups that continue to exist. Many monuments and symbols of past conflicts or the families of many of these victims. Like, for example, neo-Nazis waving the swastika causes active psychological harm and makes Jews feel oppressed in the modern world. The Yasukuni Shrine in Japan, for example, and how its very presence is offensive to Korean comfort women or families of Chinese soldiers killed by genocide. The very existence of these symbols causes tangible third-party harm to many of these minorities or their families, which continue to exist. This harm happens particularly when it's in the public sphere rather than in a museum, because the use of these monuments by those who hold power is uniquely offensive and oppressive. The very presence of these monuments makes these people feel like they do not belong. The fact that people are enshrined in these beliefs, it makes people feel like their lives are worth nothing. This is bad because obviously democracy can only operate with most views with at least the basic social consensus that we deserve to live together. And we think that views that are abhorrent by standards tend to be views that are uniquely and entirely exclusionary, and views that tell minorities either implicitly or explicitly that they do not belong in our societies. And we think this causes massive harm to people who are still alive. Yes.
So why can't white nationalism now rally upon your very public museums?
Because museums often have historical context that is tagged onto these monuments. First of all, museums don't enshrine these individuals, unlike a memorial. And moreover, a statue of Cecil Rhodes, for example, will be nuanced and will be tailored with its historical context, that he was an actor in the war of colonialism, in the scramble for Africa, for instance. So we think that museums are fairly different. Second argument, that this props up racial supremacy. We think the reason why we have racial violence is not because the majority of people in the USA happen to be white Nazi supremacists. It's because the majority of white voters have become too inured to racial prejudice and may even consider, given historical context, it to be an inevitable fact of life. What does removing these monuments do? We give you two benefits. First of all, we remove monuments that tie a cultural or national narrative to individuals or ideas that were exclusionary or repulsive. We think that many of these memorials have created the notion that there are two sides to the story regarding colonialism, for example, that there are two sides to the story regarding the Confederacy in the Civil War. We want to break the notion because we think that tying it to historical and cultural monuments allows these views and racist views to perpetuate far longer. It provides a basis for the silent majority to remain silent because it creates a minimum degree of ambiguity with regard to issues that should be fairly clear-cut, like, for example, whether colonialism in Southeast Asia was bad. So we think that removing these monuments allows us to rally against white nationalists. Secondly, I think Ott might say very reasonably that this will embolden white nationalists, that they will stand up and rally against the fact that these symbols and these figures are being taken away from them. First of all, we argue that if they really step up and if they cause public unrest, this is good because it allows the public to see them for the filth that they are and engage them in protest against the presence of Muslims. Look at, for example, how the protests in Charlottesville have spread international criticism. So we think that emboldening white nationalism may be good because it allows the public to see them for the filth. Discourse. It is not clear why the monument is necessary for discourse to happen. If anything, the monument makes it far more difficult because it's harder for you to negotiate and engage in rational discourse with someone at a white supremacist rally standing under the statue of Robert E. Lee, because emotions tend to be higher and there tends to be a greater element of xenophobia and there tends to be greater sentiments against these individuals from even appearing to begin with. Moreover, we put to you that often, for the victims of many of these oppressive acts or their families, often these monuments and memorials are thought terminating, which means that the very presence of these monuments makes them afraid and makes them want to shy away because it demarcates an unsafe space for them. It indicates that they do not belong in these areas. So we think that discourse is actually worse when these memorials exist. Moreover, we think that we better engage against white nationalists and we better promote a more holistic view of history. I'm proud to stand and open it up.
I thank you for that speech. Now let's invite you here.
Mr. Speaker, we believe that for this debate to properly operate, we need to properly contextualize the world that we're living in today. This is not that we're talking about. This is not a situation where a monument dictates the entire face of public discourse within status quo. We argue that we are situated in a world where you have social media, where political ideals that run contrary to oppression can easily ferment and gain critical mass to be able to forward the kind of beneficial ideals that you want to have in society in status quo. We argue that in instances such as in the Middle East, for example, in Syria, Tunisia, and Egypt, it was precisely these instances where we see that political ideologies that run contrary to even state-level oppression were allowed to ferment to facilitate the kinds of uprisings that were ultimately beneficial for the sovereignty of these individual peoples. So we don't believe that a monument dictates it, but we argue that even if we do accept the idea has certain impacts upon individuals, we argue that the specific context is going to be, at the end of the day, result in more beneficial outcomes for discourse and for assimilation and reconciliation between opposing parties within society. So this debate, or at the end of the day, is not about the proliferation of increasing, right? It's about this convincing context and the acts of actively removing them, which we believe will be perceived to be an assault on the ideas of the people that they wanted to talk about. And this is what we are going to be situating our debate over. I'm going to talk about proof largely two things in my substantive debate. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how active steps taken to curtail the thoughts of these individuals, because that's their perception, is going to result in greater harm in society. And second, I'm going to talk about how this hurts reconciliation efforts at the end of the day. My substantive will be so first, let's clarify what are the kinds of states that are most likely to want to remove these kinds of monuments as a result of the context, right? We argue that these are states that are likely to be liberal leaning to begin with, and it's only in these instances where there's going to be a popular mandate to want to shift these kinds of things, right? And we argue that it is precisely in these instances the kinds of states that we have seen in the United States, for example, that we have an increasingly vocal group of individuals with hyper-conservative views that are becoming increasingly emboldened and increasingly violent towards the actions that are taken against the perception that that their voices are going to be shut out. Which is why we say that this whole idea that these individuals are going to be inured to prejudice actually is a characterization that works in our favor, because it just suggests that the likelihood of them responding to this is going to be far more likely. You only need to turn to the instance of Charlottesville to know that violence is not out of the question. But more than that, we argue, Mr. Speaker, that this whole idea of the context really matters over here. So this is where we engage with the whole conception of how the kind of context is going to be harmful to the individuals who feel hurt as a result of the historical context of the particular monument. Their own example of Abraham Lincoln, for instance, is emblematic of the fact that conceptions of humanity and morality can and will shift in status quo, which is to say that if you take a value judgment at this point of time that this particular conception is abhorrent, you risk, basically stemming the possibility that this is an idea that we can engage with, discuss with, and what applicants, is something they're willing to accept now. We argue that, education that we're willing to stand for, where all monuments should be allowed to persist and discourse to take place to their fullest extent. More than that, let's engage with the whole idea of how discourse is somehow limited and in fact harm as a result monuments are going to be situated within. We argue that the whole idea of shifting these monuments to museums in the first place is an incredibly weak and soft because you're still going to have these monuments over there appearing on Instagram, having a captions, in support of these hyper-conservative views at the end of the day. So we don't see that being a significant difference in terms of the impacts we want to have onto the people who are going to be oppressed. But more than that, we argue that the historical context and the physical context of these monuments actually work in our favor in terms of how we want the cause of this cause to eventually evolve. And this is why. Let's engage with the idea of how Cecil Rhodes, in Oxford is a symbol of the scramble of Africa and how this is somehow a bad thing. We think that having a symbol of neo-imperialism being a searing reminder of how the United Kingdom at one point of time imperialized and colonized all these countries is in fact a reminder of how history actually played out. So to shift it into the museum merely allows the figure to continue to exist while eradicating the fact that we can have very strong and powerful discourse in support for the oppressed minorities in the world. I will take closing.
Yeah, so would you then condemn these figures and these historical figures on social media like Instagram?
Yeah, so if that degree of condemnation is plausible, then we don't see why you wouldn't allow for the kind of condemnation to take place within the context, the physical context of these monuments in status quo. So we don't really understand what the contention is. So you really kind of have to defend like having monuments and not having monuments, because really just shifting it to another place kind of weakens the whole stance of the arguments at the end of the day. So what have I proven up to this point? We've proven that in the first place, this whole idea of discourse somehow being heard doesn't really happen at the end of the day. Second, I've already proven to you as well that the active step of taking this out of the picture basically creates a trigger that that motivates these individuals to react in more violent. And more than that, we argue also that it limits the kind of discourse that we can have happening at the end of the day. So then let's move on at the end of the day, then we really need to compare the likelihood of the likelihood of two different eventualities. On side proposition, what they are arguing here is in fact a situation where the moment the monument exists, all possibility of discourse and all vision is going from status quo. I've already given you substantial analysis so far as to why, given the situation that the contextualization is unlikely to happen, that people can still engage with these particular ideas given the degree to which information can proliferate. But we do see very strong evidence in status quo on social media on how there are very vocal opponents to these particular monuments speaking out and gaining credence, right? And it is precisely because of the symbolic power of that particular monument in that offensive context that has elicited the kinds of discourses, that has elicited the kind of strong responses against neo-imperialism or conservatism that they wanted to talk about. So don't let them get away with this whole idea that, with this whole idea that some better discourse the monument continues to exist in its original context. It's going to be far more powerful and far more beneficial in engaging the views of a group of people who already feel very threatened to begin with. So, Mr. Speaker, what do we really have at the end of the day? In principle, side government was unwilling to defend a stance that basically supports this cause, that basically supports that all ideas should be respected and engaged with, regardless of how abhorrent they are. We have demonstrated to you the possibility of these abhorrent views being co-opted and discussed and negotiated, leading to more beneficial outcomes at the end of the day. And it is on this basis that we're so proud to stand in opposition.
That's what the leader wants for that speech, and I'd like to invite you, Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Churchill once said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." We think, Mr. Speaker, that this debate is about the authorship of history, because for too long, racists and misogynists have held this pen of authorship. But now we know that as a society, it is wrong to put privilege on a pedestal. I'm going to talk to you about two things. One, I'll talk to you about historiography, how we allow for better discussion. And second, I'm going to talk to you about minority protection, and how do we shield minorities from harm. All constructive will be integrated. We told you that monuments do three things. First, there is a valorization of a person or idea, removed from its proper historical backdrop, emphasizing only on the positives. Second, that they exclude counter-narratives that are not similarly celebrated. So my celebration of a Confederate general comes at the cost of my capacity as a society to celebrate, for example, Harriet Truman, who ran the Underground Railroad's African-American slaves. Third, we told you that monuments anchor national identity to persons or ideas, creating a norm-setting value in society. What do we hear from opening opposition? First, an attack on our supposedly cowardly policy of relocating to museums. No, we refute this ardently. We compare this to placing Nazi symbols in museums. They are disempowered when you put them within the context of historical triumph over Nazism. Obviously, we don't stand for putting the eagle on the Reichstag, because putting that eagle on the parliamentary building symbols the continuation of said autocracy or said atrocity in society. Now we apply the parallel to the Rhodes statue. Why do white nationalist groups congregate? They don't congregate just because of the statue. They congregate because the position and the context of the statue denote power. We strip monuments of this power when the 6-foot-tall Rhodes statue is no longer overlooking you in Balliol College, but rather it is next to an exhibit about how Cecil Rhodes engaged in slavery in British Rhodesia. If your white nationalist wants to protest alongside that, good! You now look like a fool. It makes it easier for the left or for the mainstream in society to denounce these white nationalists and show the superficiality of the message as it is. Even if they can't do that, at least they can point to the historical cost of these things, rather than, as Arthur told you, say that there is an equivalentalism could have its good sides if Cecil Rhodes continues to stand outside. For example, University, Cape Town. No thank you. Further, we dispute that this debate is about the amount of discourse. Rather, it is about the character of discourse. Even if we have less discourse, we have come to the face level symbolism that Arthur told you about. Let me give you an example. Yes, the shrine, I on Twitter forget. It's not easier for the shrine and its context to convey a sense of historical triumph exceptionalism. Now, I cannot use the Yasukuni shrine, I put it in a museum. It's a lot harder for me as a white nationalist to then take a photo of its location within that museum and use my ideas. So we think that his context of social media actually fits into our case. Second reason, we think that we are better for discourse because memorials create the normalization of discursive inertia. In every public space, you see monuments or you see statues of people who convey certain repulsive ideas. It gives you no impetus with checkered history. And the reason why this is bad is that white nationalism on the far right, it thrives on the center ground. And when you are existing within a state or a polity which celebrates the far-right nationalist ideas to convince these individuals. Okay, second area on minority protection. We parallel this to why we ban Nazi symbolism and the morals of trauma inflicted on minority once born. That's what it doesn't work, because Facebook doesn't stop a black student from Africa feeling oppressed as a statue of Cecil Rhodes looking down at him in Balliol College. We think the proliferation of these statues also minorities have to engage in counter protests and disrupt it. Moreover, opposition did not rebut the argument that we have less discourse and discourse was. They still cause trauma to individuals that the state owes the state to protect these communities. So even if I still lose based on the restitutive principle, but even if I lose the restitutive, I'll deal with the argument on that sponsors. First, we think because as I told you, not white nationalists, but by the middle ground, whether or not they perceive neo-Nazis or white supremacists as like. Even people like Steve Bannon can come up in an interview and say that the right wing is fringe people. We think that very effective for people to disavow such right nationalists, sure that they won't come up again. Now they might say, but you know, it isn't a state. Where Donald Trump the fact that Donald Trump's election also energized the left wing in the DC. So to me, it doesn't mean that all the Lyndon Johnsons, these white national white polarization of this cursive in the normal in the public space. I find it hard to intend reducing their ranks. But fourth of all, we think all of this, in America of the West, white people are going to be ethnic minority in the long run. In the long future of democracy, within 40 or 50 years, these constituency people are a whole better for ethnic minorities than removing these statues. There's no clear political harm that they can demonstrate to us. For all these reasons, I am incredibly proud to propose.
Then Deputy Prime Minister, that's the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
In which discourse works. Discriminating and reminded the greater point being removed, something taken away, as they put it, a rallying point when all monuments left in their world are going to be monuments of the left. That is what creates an assault on the right, and we believe that emboldens their rhetoric, emboldens discrimination, and ultimately hurts individuals more than offense, which frankly isn't really a tangible harm anyway. Two areas of contention. First, effects rhetoric on second exists
in order to describe the surroundings them, whether with the actor, if they do something they believe to be rightfully theirs, that is when you embolden their rhetoric. When you can say the state is taking away something from me. But what is important is this. Many of the kinds of rhetoric that are left wing now press established materialism other times. Moves away a statue or removes the statue. However, they want to screw this motion. To say, look, the state is silencing us. That is what creates violence on the ground. For the at least to response to this first. At what cost does this really come up? So already a real example, really offended, and it is a far greater compared to the violent cost incurred. When you the question is, does this act? We try that you our as whole of individuals attempt to view the perception of here we changing the mind of the right. But we are going to watch in the change discourse as well. Perhaps it is true that any more left-leaning or any more censored. In fact, it only makes them move further away to the right. That's why when we remove the African Renaissance monument, the Senate increased because people felt more others can say, yeah, so many people are allying with us now, we have a liberal majority. Because you try to remove these statues. What does this prove? It proves that the act of removal in and of itself is the creator, is the instant discrimination. It proves it's necessary. I don't think we can buy that. Go ahead.
So, waving Nazi and Soviet symbols outside the synagogue, is that okay with you? Is that a hard?
So you ban people from doing it. If it's a commonplace practice already and you stop people from doing it, then you'll create huge amounts of harm. What we're talking about very simply in opening is that the change in the way you perceive things is what creates the harm. So if these statues were never there, and you let the statue, sure, there might be some harm, they're the crews. But the statue has always been there. The removal of these statues then creates a change in the minds of the public and therefore creates a change in discourse. That's the essential argument coming from OG. Second, the discourse that surrounds these monuments anyway. So Obright's government came with a very naive conception about how discourse or how contextualization and authorship changes the minds of individuals. They claim or believe that white nationalists will probably change their minds if these statues no longer are in the place that they once were. So white nationalists will go into a museum, read the historical context, and suddenly believe, oh, I really like minorities now. You see, that's just a naive conception of how people conceive of their own beliefs. So thank you, both of you. We believe that the only is to have an inclusive kind of discourse. A discourse that is situated within the historical context in which oppression took place. There is no point debating about whether past oppression was good or bad if you're going to see a statue in a museum. It is only when you know this is the location where oppression took place in the past. This is the location where blacks were discriminated against, that the empowerment of the voice of the left becomes ever more meaningful when you can rally against these perceptions at the spot in which it happens. So sure, even if we accept the scale of the motion and say it's just moving away the statue, the importance of situating in a historical context still exists. They claim that discursive inertia stops people from therefore creating this kind of discourse that we want on our side. Yeah, sure, discursive inertia only really exists if we have like 10 statues of Rhodes in Oxford, right? But that just isn't the case. Discursive inertia doesn't exist when we have one statue, one rallying point around which this discrimination happening around the whole statue on a day-to-day basis, but you will if you try to remove it. My extension method for today is going to talk about how our stance of morality change over time. And it is in fact colonialism and oppression to remove these statues of the past. Well, thank you. Now, we want to accept that democracy is really about an acceptance of many voices, a plurality of voices. Only when we understand in democracies that there are no closed questions can we actually progress to any sort of meaningful vote. Why is this such a big thing? Because if we believe that the left is always right, if we believe that liberalism is necessarily always right, then there doesn't need to be a vote. There doesn't need to be any sort of negotiation of rights, because we'll always favor the left anyway. But what does this mean? It means that standards in societies change over time. Societies themselves change. And today's standards, the way in which we view the discourse that surrounds monuments, are fundamentally arbitrary. History, however, is consistently created. And the way in which then we interpret the statues over time shapes the way our discourse around democracy is affected. When they try to colonize the past by saying, we believe that the past is wrong in this way and no future society should ever reconsider the thoughts of the past, we believe that that is effectively oppressing individuals in the past, oppressing thoughts that could potentially be potent within democracies. Where do we see this in real life? We see the Che Guevara statue, for example, being a rallying point by which we can discuss issues of nationalism. Whereas, if we remove these statues and say, we always believe in the values of the left, then you won't have the kind of democratic discourse that we want to see around ideas of nationalism, which might actually have real world implications in the world today. So because today's standards of what we view as abhorrent is arbitrary, and these standards can change, we don't think you should colonize the past and remove these symbols because they could be something, or they could instigate a talking point in democracy. In opening up.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Office for that speech. Now, to be in the closing half of the debate, I invite the member of government.
Silence only empowers the oppressors and always disadvantages the oppressed. Do not let opening opposition get away with the idea that everyday today oppression or day-to-day racism is okay, even though it's not violent. We think that it's actually more harmful, the fact that you have to live every day in trauma. I will deal with the speaker before me in 4 responses, but moving on to the unique extension from closing our government side on why restructures majoritarian populations to be a lot better when you actually take down these monuments. But first, let's deal with the most recent thing that came from the speaker before me. This idea about how things must change over time and that things must always evolve. So first of all, the changes can't happen if you always have the barriers of the past. We don't think you get your benefit of democracy always evolving if you always have the reminders that people always rally around, right? Second response to this is that governments shouldn't be complicit in things that they feel are atrocities, right? If we feel like the genocide is an atrocity, we shouldn't be complicit in allowing that thing to be celebrated on a day-to-day basis. The third response to this is that it's not about left or right. This is a unique response to come from closing government side, given the fact that it's not about whether or not we always push forward the left. Rather, it's about governments trying to equalize narratives, right? Given the fact that something has always been historically supported, this means that they have a dominant narrative that we want to change now, right? In order to change that, you must tear down that particular monument in order to allow the proliferation of others to happen, right? In their world, it will always be skewed to one side or another. We want to change that, right? So if this particular thing becomes more dominant in the future, we also tear that down. But secondly, right, it's the idea about permanence of objects, right? This assumes that there's no serious harm to seeing it every day. Because all your decisions and all your interactions with a minority to the one monument that you were always seeing whenever you were young, right? This means that the minority tries to tell you that colonialism is harmful to them and has historical oppression to them, or trying to support affirmative action. You think no, that picture of that monument of Francis that I saw ever since I was young was one that is against this. This means it's harder for minorities to actually convince you that to change your stance using rationality. You always use that memorial instead. But the second thing is that this idea about the feelings of assault, right? We think that that assault is actively forces you to shift in stance, right? The fact that the CEO of Merck actually there were actual changes on the ground, right? The fact that Bloody Sunday in the civil rights movement in 1965 March, a lot of people, a lot of the international community saw school children protesting being attacked. It was this that pushed all people to take a stance than another, right? We think that the silence means that you're actually complicit in more of these harms, whereas if there's a triggering point that encourages just the international stance that's a lot better, right? We don't think the international community should stay silent in this. The next thing that they say is like this hatred on the state, right? So they assume that the hatred on the state by like white supremacists is the most harmful thing. We would say that you hatred by minorities, right? The fact that is because they always feel that the state is complicit against them, right? The fact that a lot of like individuals, a lot of minority individuals never support the state is actively because you traded them off. We think that you'd rather take on these white supremacist hatred compared to minority disenfranchisement. The last thing I would say is this idea about like inclusive discourse, right? Look, like this inclusive discourse assumes that there's equal power in all sides of that discourse. We don't think that's true, given the fact that white supremacists have always had dominant historical narrative. It's about what tools you give each like actor, right? The tool that the white supremacists always have is monuments and nostalgia, right? Whereas minorities will always have to rely on like empowerment rhetoric or rationality, empower that rationality compared to a constant fight against monuments. But why doesn't actively restructure majoritarian populations to be a lot better? Because while the opening government side actively pushes forward for the protection of minorities, we think we must go to the root of the problem, which is white majoritarian people or majoritarian populations that are victimized literally by this narrative. Before I move on, closing. Yeah, actually.
The motion assumes that there's been a change in the standards we live in. Why aren't minorities looking at these statues and reclaiming the historical narrative around it and empowering them as an instrument of benefit?
Yeah, then you're soft too, right? Because if you well, let's rely on you being able to convince that individual that your condemnation is correct. Second, in your social media will only be around your friend group. We think there's an echo chamber within that. So it's not like your condemnation will actually change white majoritarian people. We think that this is where my extension comes in, right? That we actually change the mindsets of white majoritarian people that's uniquely from opposing government. We think that majorities are victims of this narrative, right? We always assume that the majorities are the most evil, but they are also quite victimized within this state. Why do we say that? It's because like historical figures were able to convince generations that they were great, given all these tools of oppression that they use, right? This means that whenever they erect a statue, you are more able to exploit these white majoritarian people and convince them to be racist, right? This is why, instead of correcting abhorrent mindsets that they should have done, instead they empowered and perpetuated these mindsets. We think it's a duty of governments to actively correct this now, because it results in three things for these majoritarian races. Like first, you're unable to recognize your own interests because you're always blinded by nationalism or you're always blinded by racism, right? This means that that's exactly why you voted in Trump, right? Without regarding the fact that they're actually more victimized by a lot of their policies, they were convinced that they should vote in Trump. But secondly, they were unable to create meaningful relationships with minorities, right? As a result of entrenched racism and or sexism, built in and empowered by all these monuments, they aren't able to actually interact with a lot of minority individuals. But the third thing is that you accept authorities that are similar to historical figures that you already really respect, right? Every time you see a historical figure and you see a politician that may not be good for you but looks like that figure or acts like that figure, you therefore vote that person into place without proper rationality, right? The comparative is that even if we have backlash, which will eventually die out as each generation comes, it means that a lot of these individual white majority people will have to rely on rationality compared to the actual symbolism of symbolism. Which means that it actively restructures these individuals to be a lot better and pulls them out of the victimization of blindness that you currently have, because you're always going to entrench that blindness in your world compared to ours. Then it means that you cannot rely on these things anymore. We think that in order to uplift minorities, like what OG wants, you first have to change these white majoritarian races, and the only way to change that is by not being complicit in further trying to empower their racism, right? That's a comparative that we bring to you. We think that we think that what happens in our world is that we restructure a lot more reparatively. So even if it means about minorities, we think that we need to give that reparation to minorities and equalizing the playing field of narratives that they will never have, because they're always entrench all these majoritarian narratives.
The member of government for that speech, and I'd like to invite the member of opposition.
It is the statues of Robert E. Lee, of Cecil Rhodes, of Mahatma Gandhi that must remain rooted in society's moral fabric and weather through the course of history as indicators of the people we have become, but more importantly, of the people that we will go on to be as a result of the changing narratives around these statutes. Closing opposition will argue two things. Firstly, why the removal of these statues become a trigger to historical amnesia, but more importantly and secondly, how do these oppressive statues now as a result of changing narratives become a focal rallying point around the oppressed. But before that, a note on the cowardly model coming in from opening government. The first thing they say is that, oh, we'll remove it from parliament, we'll put it then in a museum with a lot of context. Here's the thing about museums. They have the full backing and legitimacy of being a historical treasure chest. That means anything you put in there is validated for the things that was created as a result of the past. That means, according to them, the pedestal of the privilege is more likely to be entrenched. How so? All the heroic things that these generals did when they fought in the formation of the Union, these are things that will be glorified in the museums. As much as they say you can provide some historical context, that there will be analysis on the comfort women that were harmed by these individuals, we think that the current majoritarian narrative means that everything they believed in is validated by the way the museum works, which is to suggest that the preservation of these statues, the historical context that they provide around these statues, means that everything that was done around these things also agree to the sentiments of these white majoritarian people. So they don't necessarily change the pedestal or privilege that these statues exist in, rather enforce it in a greater way. But secondly, they say, oh, it's an offense to minorities. We don't think it's like you actually mitigate the offense to the minorities. Because of the way these statues now operate in these museums, we think it's more likely that they will be more offensive to these minorities if they currently say that these minorities have no capacity whatsoever, especially when we heard in Member of Government that they don't have any instruments to be able to change or to be able to provide a counter narrative to the historical oppression that they provide. We will show you instead how the minorities have been able to reclaim these statues and provide counterfactuals to how history has treated them. But then looking on to Member of Government, the biggest contention coming from Member of Government is that you want to change the conception of white majoritarian people. Three responses to this. First thing they say is that white people are victims. Individuals to those of the African American people who continue to be slaves, and that they are who have been slaves for many years, and now you're seeing the ancestors of these slave owners are also part of these victims. We think they're more likely to be empowered by this because they also understand that this is what allows me to be racist, allows me to be oppressive towards these individuals because of the validation I provide to these statues. But secondly, they say, oh, you start to vote in figures like Trump because now we associate Trump looking like Robert E. Lee. I don't think that's necessarily true because this argument was made in a vacuum. Understand that currently, when a lot of white nationalists have come out in protest, the reason why they come out in protest is because they're possessed of by that of the minorities being a politician that looks like this is unlikely to believe that these are individuals that convert this. The continuous existence of these statues creates a blindness. I don't think it creates a blindness. Rather, what it creates is a staggering constant because you're unable to then shift more views that we're currently already making on our side. You're able to believe that these generals or these individuals want very oppressive individuals because the lack of a statue means you don't have that visceral attention that media brings to you when you're protesting now around the Robert E. Lee statue. We think this is particularly important as ammunition for minorities to come out and control the way in which these narratives affect them. The absence of these statues means they don't have the same to operate. On to argumentation. No, thank you. How will this removal trigger historical amnesia? Understand that the way in which people consume history now is by going to these very public places and looking at these statues and understanding the realities around these statues. And according to them, they'll provide more historical context. We think that's perfectly fine to us. So if you walk down the streets in Korea, you're likely to see Korean war generals memorialized on their street. What this means is that when you visit these areas, it's easier for people to document and say, this is what was done by these particular types of generals. And even if, as a minority, I was affected by it, we are more likely to see some contextualization, especially because there's a change in the current perceptions of these historical journals to be able to accommodate these types of views. We think that the way in which public spaces work is by comparison to the other side, when you just leave it to just documentaries or leave it to academicians trying to discuss the way in which these things work. We think there's a high barrier of entry for people to opt into these types of ways in which you discuss the historical perceptions of these journals. We think the comparison of having historical statues in public means a lot of people can connect and be able to understand the realities around it. No, thank you. But secondly, if you say that the filth of nationalism must come out, the one thing that you need to look at when a lot of white supremacists are coming up through the organizations like the Christian Vanguard is because they feel that their position is currently being threatened. This is the type of progress we've been able to make as a result of more minorities being able to step up and condemn the statue of Robert E. Lee, right? We think this not only forces politicians within the Republican Party itself to take a position to denounce and condemn these types of statues. I think these are particular benefits that is important in order for you to mitigate the type of polarization you currently see in politicians. But more importantly, it's important that you connect the emotions that these people face to the statues that they see. It's important for African Americans to be able to carry out discourse not just by the boringness of rationality, but rather to use their emotions, because it is through their emotions can you actually convey the pain of that oppression that these individuals face. I think that's particularly important in the way the character of this discourse takes place. But how has this meaning evolved? And I think we need to engage with this. The first thing they say is that, when the way in which the statues have evolved in its meaning is that more and more minorities have been able to step up and say, these are statues of oppressors and we need to condemn these individuals. The comparison on their side is that when you remove this, immediately you validate that these white, the moment they're likely to do is to step in and continuously deny the bad tragedies that were committed by these journalists. That's why we think the state cannot be complicit in allowing these white nationalists who control large mainstream forms of media to be able to deny the existence of these atrocities. But more importantly, when you remove these statues, what they're likely to also do is to glorify the very acts that these individuals have taken place in the mainstream media. At that point, you're not only going to create a more polarizing narrative of the way history is being perceived, but you also remove more ammunition for minorities in the way they determine the value of history that you create for them. But finally, we say that it is extremely important because the way the narratives have evolved is one to include a lot more individuals to participate in this. That's why we've been able to see more and more moderates rallying around minorities as a result of them also condemning these statues. These are unique benefits that are important for us to make more progress on minorities and also to ensure that these statues remain as pillars for us to move forward.
Thank the member Robbins for that speech. And now I'd like to invite the government witness. Here.
To allow the existence of these statues is also to liberalize thought and discussions. The problem with these thoughts and discussions that we heard from side opposition was that they can't be regulated, can't be mediated, and we saw no alternative to why, on earth, individuals on the ground who were oppressed by these same rhetorics could speak up for themselves, just because by virtue they are minorities and oppressed. This was the illogical fallacy that came out from opposition, and this is what prevents them from taking this debate. Before I move on to talk about closing opposition and then opening opposition and issues, let's talk about what needed to be engaged in this debate from Felice's argument. Felice told you that generally, as a result of symbolism that's not based on blindness, people can't rely on this blindness on statues' immortality. And this was analysis that was important. Why? Because when you put a statue up there to validate something that was at that time important, this gives an immortality sense to it, that it was so important that we had to build a physical structure to commemorate this idea. At the point that you denounce this by taking it away, that is when you're able to remove that barrier to discussions or proper discourse to why on earth the oppressions that actually killed or harmed people can be justified or could not be justified by these individuals. This gives an excuse for governments to be complicit, and this was engaged by Dave's speech for a few reasons. Because what Felice told us is important as a result of the removal of statues in the Philippines. I think those are statues that commemorated the authoritarian figure of authoritative and dictative structures and people and presidents to come up and rise up and oppress people continuously because people thought that was normal or that was a cool thing for leaders to have. These are rhetorics that we denounce directly in the world of government. But secondly, white majoritarians cannot opt out of it or don't have to generally feel that they've been stereotyped on as people who are generally faced as people who are oppressive in the past, because not everyone wants to continue that veil as a result of that. Moving on to closing opposition first and issues. The first thing I like to contest is that I don't know what the comparison alternative is. Because if we told them, if they told you that generally that museums also glorify individuals, we told you a few reasons why museums are far better in comparison. In Felice's speech as well, an extension. Because museums give you a high barrier to unnecessary discussion. Let's talk about a discourse that generally happens on site opposition. That discourse there is unregulated in the open field. This means that they'll use a lot of rhetorics that viewed them in the past, meaning things that were unbiased or unrationalized will be used in those fields. And I think that these are the most harmful ones because they don't have any backing. The comparison in museums that is exclusive to closing government is that generally these things are researched upon. There are actual biases and actual researchers that come into play to justify whether individuals were oppressed or not oppressed in those situations, identified through research and books and documentaries that these things are justified, that these things are atrocious and should be condemned. That is when you get a more valid discussion from our side of the field. But what about association? What about the high barriers to entry of discussing these perceptions? I think it's good that we have some high barriers to entry because it's not really for all people to think. Especially nationalistic or in favor of actual discussions, they use it to justify their own retorts of why they should be racist. Because we did it in the past, because it's a legit statute that commemorates these kind of things. And these are the most harmful acts of all. But more importantly, about minorities being able to condemn. I don't know how minorities get the power in their side to actually condemn these statues, because sure, you can say a few things, but as Felice said and wasn't engaged, that these are all echo chambers and these are all stuck to your own grounds or to your own community. It doesn't actually discourse or have evidential proof against your majoritarians that oppressed you in the past, and this is what makes it really weak for minorities to use that statue and try to condemn it as well. But on the last end about white people denying its existence, so I think it's much harder to also deny if they are existent, why their acts were so oppressive in the past, and they must reconcile with it as a result. But more importantly, I think even if they want to say that white people can, push away responsibility for these things, at least they cannot use the statues to oppress these individuals in the future anymore. It will not be a valid argument, even though it's a really dumb argument to minorities. So they never really showed us how that will come into cause and effect and play. Before I move on to openings issues, sure.
The majority of the US is white, but the majority are not white nationalists. So what majority are you exactly restructuring? And what minority views do you think are not heard in increasingly liberal?
So you have to prove this in your argument, because your argument had tension about this. Your first speaker told us that generally it was really liberal in the state, that the US is really liberal. But in the same breath, you said that that conservatives were really strong as well and could oppress. So which one is it? Are conservatives really strong and oppress minorities, or are minorities in the past who were oppressed, like the LGBT, African American people, really strong now? I'll clarify this here. The first thing that we must engage is what does discourse look like in comparison. Discourse in opening government looked like people talking at a statue or talking about a statue out in a vacuum. And this was bad for a few reasons I told you. But the comparison that we've given you is that generally, when you have no discourse that is centralized around this figure, that's when you can have better discourse about whether this person deserves rights, but whether this person deserves a benefits, and we can be more progressive if we don't stagnate ourselves around the statue. But more importantly, about whether states are liberal. So maybe states are liberal in a way, but we can't really ascertain, because that means you disempower a lot of liberal values with the existence of bad values that you still empower within these statues itself. You must understand who uses these statues to empower themselves. It is people who are generally more authoritative, who are more oppressive and dictative that use these things, and we must stop them in power. We haven't got justification why this was not the case. But more importantly, at least the benefit that's on closing government is that we are able to push for, we make it harder for them to push, to use these statues as argumentations. That's so important. But on the idea of antagonism, which was the biggest contention there, I think that it will be just as racist in the world of opposition, but just in different ways. That they have the statue, but they still microaggress you. They still don't give you those drops. They still have an incognitive bias that you are generally someone who's weaker than them. I think that these are really harmful. So taking down these statues is literally a step forward for minorities, because minorities at least feel empowered at the end of the day, that they don't have to struggle through this oppression as well as bad as it was last. But what about morality and changing over time? You don't achieve this inside opening opposition for a few reasons. Because generally, this microaggression and this rhetoric, as long as it still remains, as long as a statue identifies with someone's ideology, you cannot remove it from that person. Only when you are able to condemn it or remove it and put it in a particular neutral place, that is when you are able to get the best discourse possible. Go which side? Closing government.
Yeah.
I thank the government work for that speech now to wrap up the debate. There you go.
The first thing that I'm going to say to you from the speaker before me is that I think Daniel dismisses a lot of Dave's argument. I think literally everything, because our extension is literally unique from opposition, right? What have Dave told you in this debate? Number one, we have told you that it's easier for people to know the history of that statue. On-site government, documentaries will still exist, and it's not exclusive because it can still exist on our side. Right? But it actually exists in the public. So it's the system of this statue itself. That very from the skill, people can still because this is not only higher numbers on comparison. I'm going to tell you why it's much more meaningful, right? Because the argument that Dave told you is about the validation of the anger that these particular people have. For example, the white people will deny the value of the statue because they remove the statue for them. When the government itself, put down, remove the statue because of the white people itself, that means that you validate the anger as a result. That because they're now are because you literally just do whatever they actually wanted, right? Yeah. And number two, they'll be less likely to listen towards society action. You validate the people because you right now remove the statue of oppression, for example. This means that they'll be more likely to being racist towards the African American. They'll be more to act like heinously, for example, because you validate by removing the action, the statue itself, right? And then the complicity argument from side opposing government, right? It's tackled by Dave also. We've told you that because government is more complicit as a result. Because when you actually this is the reason why you'll be complicit because like you actually validate the action, then they'll be horribly, right? I'm going to deal with the closing government before going to opening government. The first thing is that about the research that Daniel told you, right? I think the research will be much better on our side, because the research itself can be attached to the research and the study itself, right? This means that the better value is shown in public. This means that the minority will get less power for not having the study on your side, right? And to rally, to do protest on that particular area, and people will be able to understand and recognize that the statue exists, and people rally because of that particular statue. On the comparative on-site government, when they actually don't have the statue, or maybe have it in museum, then people can't really know that people actually rally for that statue. Then people just go to museum and not the museum as a whole, right? We just have to understand, as a result of collection of people going there to that particular statue, the moderate white people will be more likely to join you as a result of that, because they know that you actually fight against the white supremacy and whatsoever. I think that let's take them to the best case scenario, like take them to their model, which is that take the museum. I don't think it's effective at all, because people don't go to museum every day. People don't go to museum just for fun or whatsoever. I think it's just harmful, right? And the second harm that we've told you is that the future generation can question it as a result of that, because the progress is better on our side, because historical narrative that the statue is oppression, right? This means that the more moderate future generation on our side, because it's much more better when people have discussion on our side. That's why the discussion is much more meaningful on our side, right? The second thing that I told you is that about why people are the roots of the problem. I think more used to believe that the statue creates attention in the media is a good thing. This means that like the argument from police itself is a vacuum itself, right? Because that was the history, dude. Like maybe people see it as a bad thing, right? People see it as a good thing, but right now people see it as a bad thing, right? It means that it's so convenient for this means they analyze this, because we told you the complicity argument inside from opposing government is not true if they're still okay with the statue to exist in the museum itself. The argument of police brought was and then like Daniel suddenly said that they also okay with the museum. I don't think it's so fair for them to do that, right? No, thank you. Now I'm going to deal with opening government. I'm just going to say that the model doesn't make any sense at all. Like used to rely symbols show something oppressive or whatsoever, that all the harms that they want to talk about, right? I agree with you that all the harms might accrue, right? But it's about which side actually mitigate it much better. The act of removing the memorials will make it better, because it will make it much worse. Understand that OG's case is not mutually exclusive, because if they want to put it to the museum itself, which is literally a place for people to visit, all the harms of what OG have told you on our side will still exist on their side, because the statue still exists on their side. Discussion of all the bad things that will still happen on their side, I don't think is fair for them, right? And so if it's still there, then the harms what OG said, such as the trigger of anger or whatsoever, will still exist on their side. I don't think it's just. I don't think it's mutually exclusive on their side. I'll take you later. Please sit down. And here is the clash on opening government. They also said that this statue is harmful to exist. This means that even though that they have the statue in the museum, all the harms will still occur on their side, right? And the last thing, the second thing that they talk about is about discourse will be better, because people will see you on our side see it as a glorification of that action, right? I think this is uncomparative at all, because understand that the statue is a real creation of curiosity. It's the source of discourse that David told you to begin with, right? You can't just say that they don't know the meaning because they freaking learned history at school or whatsoever, right? If you say that but before that, I'll take close.
Yeah, so if you spend, these white supremacists spend all their time defending a historical figure that they feel very emotionally about, this like lessons, the productive discourse that you say you want, then how is historical amnesia such a harm?
I don't think it's like. I think like the anger is the validation of the anger itself when you actually remove the statue itself. It's the reason people get angry and not being able to fight against the white supremacists as a whole, because people actually remove that statue because of that. And I think it's just not fair. And the second thing that OG told you, and the second response to OG is that if you say that you have a museum, sure you'll have discourse, but your discourse is worse than ours, right? People will pass through every day and for more curiosity on our side. People don't go to museum every day. The point of putting it there is to make sure that discourse continuously happens. On site government discourse happens less because people don't feel it less because it's just in the museum and people don't go to museum every day. I don't know why by putting it in the museum compared to public can suddenly create more discourse. I think it's less discourse, especially when people don't really see the statue itself. I think they lose this debate. For all those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you with the speech. Please come forward, shake hands, step outside. Hey, someone do me a favor and just like run to the and get a ballot. I could write something. Yeah. Yeah, if you could write it down, thank you. Are there runners? I don't know.